Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast. Today I have Eyal Aviv. He's an assistant professor at Columbian College of Art Sciences. We're going to talk about Buddhist philosophy and intellectual history. So, Eyal, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've spoken to people of the Jewish faith, Christian faith, Catholic faith, etc., but Buddhist, not yet. Tell me a bit about your journey. How did you first learn about Buddhism and study it?
So my journey actually started with growing in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths around me. I was born in Israel, and I spent most of my young adult life in Jerusalem. I lived there for 7 years. So I was surrounded by people who are practicing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I was really trying hard to find my way and understand why people are so excited. So I learned those traditions. I met with Christian monks and with Jewish rabbis, but never found myself completely inspired by what I've heard and met. So as a young person, I got really interested in reading broadly in different philosophical traditions and was really attracted to Asian religions. It was a time before the internet, so the early 90s, and there's not a whole lot of Buddhism back then in Israel. So I had to find curiosity in whatever literature was available. And eventually I decided to travel to Asia and learn from Buddhists themselves. So in 1993, I traveled to Thailand and stayed in a monastery for a couple of months and did an intensive meditation retreat. That completely upended my world, and it was an eye-opening experience, to say the least. I wanted to stay there more, but my parents were very concerned that I'm on a way to become a monk. So I, out of concern for the well-being, I left and went to China and studied there for about 6 months in a university in Sichuan province. Fell in love with the culture. And when I came back to Israel, I integrated both, and I did a BA focusing on East Asian philosophies and cultures, especially on Buddhism in China. And then I did.
One quick question here. What are some of the tenets of Buddhism that appear to be universally known or are important for people to understand? I would guess most people don't know much about Buddhism except Buddhists themselves. So for listeners that don't know anything about it, what are some of the main tenets of Buddhism?
So Buddhists start from the point of view that suffering, or in the most subtle way, disease, is a universal phenomena for everything that exists, including us humans, but not only humans. And the major project on the Buddhist path will be to alleviate the suffering or the disease for ourselves and for others. And the path that leads there is really what this tradition developed over thousands of years. So people on this path are engaging in all sorts of practices to increase the well-being themselves, their communities, and the world as a whole.
Okay, well, what is it about Buddhism that attracted you when you started studying it, versus other religions or other thinking systems?
Personally, just a bit of a background. I grew up in time of conflict in the Middle East, which is a bit of a interesting thing to say about a region that is strife with conflicts all the time. But what attracted me was reading about the wisdom of some of those Buddhists, and not just Buddhists, but also figures from other traditions in Asia that exude this kind of wisdom, and the kind of calm and equanimity that was very attractive for me as a young person who just finished his army service and was full with doubts and with emotions and confusion. And reading it was therapeutic to me, really on an existential level. I was dealing with a lot of uncertainties and anxieties, and just reading about that was so soothing. The stories, the history of some of those people, the biographies, and the way that they see the world seem to be so different from what I grew up with. So I can talk about several examples of how this worldview is different from the kind of mainstream that a lot of us are used to in our part of the world. And it was just fascinating for me. So I felt curiosity and attraction to learn more. That's what drew me to the temple, and that's what drew me to.
Yeah, tell me about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Repeat that. You said you what at a temple?
So I was just saying that this was the driving force that drew me to these traditions and drawing me ever since, because I keep learning and studied those texts and learning from these teachers ever since.
Well, again, what have you learned, and how has it been useful in your life? What's an example or two?
One of the insights that animate the tradition is the understanding that we tend to see ourselves as a subject, that are somehow perceiving the world as out there, and we see objects in the world as represented by our minds, but they're outside of us. And the Buddhists tend to think that this is an illusion, right? That the world is other than that. They tend to think that the world is that we are co-created with the world. So in other words, there is a deep level of relationality between who we are at the most fundamental way and the world around us. This leads to an opening in which we can envision a world that will be different from the world that we are envisioning right now. So that has interesting social and even political implications that we can develop if there is an interest. At the most fundamental existential level, it means that the self, right, and the selfhood, the individual, which is so important for our Western civilization, is perceived not as a thing, but rather than that as a process or a set of processes that operate always in connection to the world at large. So we are embedded in a world, and although we experience ourselves as separate, we are with the meditative practices and with the contemplative exercises that develop and hone for thousands of years, Buddhists could learn to see themselves as deeply embedded in the world and feel themselves much more connected than many of us are feeling in this time.
How has this been useful to you in your upbringing and your daily life?
There's a new book that just came out recently by the neuroscientist Eyal Aviv. And he said it pretty nicely. He said that every time sciences displace us from the center of things, it is giving us back far more in return. And I think that it's true also for Buddhism. Once we are not in the center of everything, it changed my moral perspective. I stopped seeing myself as a center of my universe, and instead saw myself as connected very deeply to my community, to my family, and to the world as a whole, to nature. And this notion of separateness that gripped me so much as a young person, dealing with anxieties and with uncertainties, I wouldn't say that it was replaced. I can't claim that I'm very advanced, like some experienced meditators, but it did lead me to a much more ease in the way that I experience my everyday life. I don't know. Hopefully it makes sense.
Well, how did you figure out, though, that you're connected to your family and to the world around you? Why do people have a sense of disconnection, and how do they reconnect? How did you do it? Besides just, bloop, you felt better.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, well, that's a really wonderful question. So according to Buddhist analysis, we all experiencing ourselves, and this is embedded in us as human, as selves. And this is not a problem. This is part of our programming. The problem starts when we cling to the self and see it as much more important than what it is, just an organizing principle that enable us to function better in the world. These patterns of clinging become embedded in the way that we interact with the world and create an illusion as if the world is really surrounded around our own perception of the world. The more we learn to ease it through practices, and there are so many different practices, and frankly, just reading some of those profound texts that give very robust arguments of why the self cannot be a substance that never changes, but it's always embedded in a larger set of processes, and it itself made up of a lot of cognitive and embodied and somatic processes. That just the reading about it and then engaging some of those practices like mindfulness, like learning how to be more attuned to the body and how the body is interacting with the world outside of my own sphere, open up a new way of seeing the world by which you feel very much connected and not restricted. So for example, when I felt anxieties and disconnection, engage with some of those practices allows me to see that I'm not alone with that. And it allowed me to see some of the conditions that gave rise to those anxieties in my upbringing and my culture, my family history. And very much like some trauma experts are talking about today, when you see the traumas that inform you, that made you, that condition you to be the person that you are, just the act of seeing and seeing deeply and in a direct experience of you experience it within yourself rather than just reading about it and reflecting on it, it has an immense healing potential that at least worked for me.
Yeah, for instance, if I'm dealing with someone that's a real jerk and they're bothering me and I'm ruminating about it, etc., what would Buddhism tell me to do to help resolve my my angst?
Well, Buddhist practice and Buddhist perspective on the jerks in our lives, and sometimes when we tend to be, not so kind, is to think about the conditions that give rise to this person. Take away the center from ourselves, our patterns of reactivity, our judgments, and not to allow ourselves to be bullied, but just to broaden the perspective and see the conditions from which this person emerged. Maybe it's a phase that he or she are going through. Maybe it's a particular history that person is carrying, a worldview that doesn't help, that or cultural patterns that they're embodied, and seeing that in a broader perspective allow us to tackle the situation much more skillfully. Now, it doesn't really negate the fact that we will have people that will behave unkindly and will be jerks, and sometimes we may be jerks to others, but it does allow plenty of openings by which we can transform our patterns of behavior and allow us to react more skillfully, either changing our own patterns or reacting to others' patterns of behavior.
It was very, very brief. I probably took like 5 minutes to look at Buddhism, literally, a while back. And it seemed to say like, life is suffering, life sucks, just understand that and deal with it. I don't know if that's like total misinterpretation of Buddhism, but
yes.
How does that figure in?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
That's a really good insight to tackle, because it's a view that dated to the first centuries of introduction to Buddhism in the West. And, you can read it among thinkers like Nietzsche and others who tended to judge Buddhism as a pessimistic religion. But it's not about life being that life sucks. And here's some of the tradition of dealing with Buddhism that someone like me who studied that tradition and trying to communicate it to students and to others are constantly struggling with. Because the terminology that the Buddhists are used are coming from different languages, more specifically in India, in languages like Pali or Sanskrit, and then in other Asian traditions that Buddhism spread to, like Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan, and so forth. The terms that they are used are very different than ours. And what is usually translated as suffering actually goes much deeper. And talking about a general sense of dis-ease, right? And dis-ease can be profoundly troubling, that we can qualify it as suffering, but it can be just the subtle notion that everything is in flux and everything that is changing. And the mere fact that we're clinging to some patterns as a psychological support and unwilling to recognize that they too are changing, are enough to cause us dis-ease in a sometimes even subconscious level. So it's not so much a pessimistic religion. On the contrary, I tend to see it as a realistic understanding of what it means to be a sentient beings who live in a world that is a constant flux. And then what are the best tools that we have to deal with that, right? How can we thrive in a world that is in constant flux? So that's the first insight, right? The world is constantly changing, and this changing can be profoundly lead to unease for us. But then you have an analysis of why this is the case, right? And this is this is where Buddhism identified the cause of the dis-ease. And according to Buddhist analysis, that this is caused by patterns of clinging, patterns of craving, where we obsess over things, maybe in extreme cases, what we call today addiction, and how to liberate ourselves from those patterns. And this is where dimensions of ethics come to the fore, dimensions of learning to see the world in a way that will liberate us from those unhelpful patterns. And some of those amazing practices that this tradition developed for thousands of years that are shown great promise in some contemporary research about implementing protocols of compassion, loving kindness, mindfulness, etc.
What does Buddhism give that's unique versus other religions, other faiths?
So faith, part of the tradition, it's a big tradition and it developed over so many different geographical areas for such a long time. So it has an amazing diversity of perspectives. And faith play a role. It's different faith from what we usually used to in Christian context, where faith is ascending to things that we cannot verify. In Buddhism, the Sanskrit term is Shraddha, and it connotes more sense of confidence, right? You're doing something, you undertake a path, and you have to trust that the path that you're on will lead you to some sort of result that you're expecting. The tradition promise. You have trust in the teachings of the Buddha and other teachings, other teachers of the tradition. So it's very different from blind faith. And what are the unique things that the Buddhist tradition? So here we are tapping into an issue that I just want to highlight. There are some people who tend to think that Buddhism offer us something very unique that you won't find in other traditions. I don't tend to think that Buddhism is exceptional, and I think that as someone who studied philosophy in general and not just Buddhism is in a creative dialogue with a lot of other traditions, and they like Taoism and Confucianism, some of the traditions that I studied as well. And what I tend to see in Buddhism is not offering something that is revolutionarily unique, because it grew up, right? It evolved in constant conversation with traditions in India, in China, in Japan, etc. And these traditions learn and influence one another. What I like about the Buddhist tradition is that it gives us a map. It gives us a framework philosophically and in terms of how to live our lives, that it's more or less cogent and coherent. So if you immerse yourself in this worldview, you get a very clear sense of how to improve your life and some of the tools and techniques that allows you to implement that and to hopefully thrive in face of a world that is so deeply relational and connected and full with dis-ease.
Different kinds of Buddhists, like you have denominations in Christianity, and you have sects in other religions, Reform, Orthodox, whatever. What about
Absolutely.
Buddhism? What kind of creatures do you have there?
Absolutely. Buddhist evolved in India. And after the Buddha died, we started to see divisions within the Buddhist community. And we see schools that evolved based on different interpretations of the Buddhist teaching, and schools that developed based on different interpretation of how they ought to live as a monastic community. From there, we see the emergence of different schools of thought, other cultures that Buddhism spread through. So you have Buddhism interacting with the local traditions. Take for an example, the Chinese civilization. That was a very advanced civilization already when Buddhism arrived to China around the 1st century CE. And after a few centuries of integration, you start to see the emergence of Chinese schools. One of the most famous among them is the Zen school, which is the Japanese pronunciation of the word Chan in Chinese, and other forms of Buddhism, schools like Tiantai and Huayan, and the very popular Buddhist school of the Pure Land. And then you have the traditions that evolve uniquely to the Tibetan traditions, where you have schools like the Gelugpa and the Nyingmapa and the Kagyu. And each one of them is bringing their own unique perspective on how to interpret the Buddhist teaching.
Well, which one do you follow most closely, and what are like some of the major divisions and some of the other types of Buddhism you've seen?
As a scholar, I tend to study especially the Mahayana tradition, which is a later development that appeared around the 1st century CE in India, and then spread to Tibet and East Asia. And so I'm not a follower of one particular tradition. I tend to learn and benefit from many of them. My own area of intellectual interest is in a school called Yogacara philosophy, Yogacara school, also known as the Mind School. Yogacara just literally means practitioners of yoga. And their unique perspective was to analyze the mind and argue that there are 8 different kinds of consciousness that make up our consciousness. And they introduced a very important component, which is the storehouse consciousness. It is a unique development for this school that recognized that a lot of the processes that contribute to the formation of ourselves are subconscious, right? And this is incredibly done about more than a millennia before this idea surfaced in the West with Freud, and that many of the tendencies that we inform our actions and the way that we think are emerging from potential energies that exist in that level of consciousness. And that has a lot of interesting dialogue with some of the contemporary insight that we have from cognitive science and modern philosophy. So that's my academic focus. I'm really fascinated by the dialogue that is, about several decades now, started in the 80s between cognitive scientists, contemporary philosophers, and some of the people who studied Buddhist philosophy like me.
So who does Buddhism not only tend to appeal to, but seeming to help transform and improve the life of? Are there people that Buddhism, it's just not their thing? And is there a common theme why? And are there people that seem to really take to it, and why?
Right. I think that Buddhism appealed to a lot of people. Traditionally, it appealed to people first of all, it appealed to a lot of people in India in the lifetime of the Buddha. And then it quickly spread. In fact, it was the first world religion before Christianity and Islam became religion that spread beyond the boundaries of where they first evolved. So there's a long history of Buddhism appeal to population around Asia. And then in the modern period, when we start to see a global war through colonial expansion, etc., we see the emergence of interest in Buddhism in the West. It appeals to it back then, and I still think today, it appealed to people who grew up in a Christian world, learned to see monotheism as crucial for any moral living, and the idea that there are people out there that do not believe in God and still have a very developed philosophical view of the world, and have a moral life that is not inferior to what Victorians saw around them, led to fascination for people who are not interested in, or maybe who grew apart from their own native religions in England at that time, but also in France and eventually also in the United States. I think that it appealed to a lot of people because of the promise for shaping our moral lives, but also our well-being. And there's a lot of hype around mindfulness that is now practiced within or sometimes also outside of Buddhist context. And a lot of excitement about how meditation can be integrated into the life of people. I'm sure that you know that there are many apps that help people to guide themselves into meditation. And people are, once they learn to know how to do it themselves, could benefit from it. Now, of course, that's not a universal thing. I'm teaching my students, and some of them are very excited to learn about Buddhism, and some of them are decided it's not for them. The idea that our self is not fixed and that ourselves are basically is an illusion that covering a lot of mental and physical processes is not for everybody. Some people find it very disturbing. Some of the aesthetics of Buddhism or some of the ideas of Buddhism, other ideas of Buddhism are not appealing to people. Maybe they're not that interested in developing compassion at this point, and they're dealing with other challenges. So my experience that it resonates with some and it doesn't resonate with others, and that's fine. There are so many other traditions to draw on.
Have you seen anyone use Buddhism as an overlay to their existing faith? Like, are there Christian Buddhists, or there Jewish Buddhists,
yeah.
And what does that look like and why?
There is a term, Jubu, which means a Jewish Buddhist that is around for quite a while, and this is partially because many of the people that were attracted to Buddhism during the 60s were Jewish, and some of the most famous teachers in Buddhism in that time and still today are Jewish, and they found ways to integrate Buddhism with their Judaism. Same thing for Christianity. I have a friend who is a Christian minister who practiced Zen. Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk who passed away in the 70s and was a great influence on Pope Francis, was also someone who learned a lot and had a fascination with Buddhism and Buddhist practice. So generally speaking, Buddhism can be integrated with other religions unless someone is very particular and exclusive about their religious practice and identity. I would say that in Asia in general, you can see many people who are Buddhist right? So Buddhism for a lot of people in Asia is not exclusive, but can be integrated with other worldview. So you can be a Buddhist and Taoist and Confucian in China, and you can be a Buddhist and Shinto in Japan, or a Buddhist and follower of the Bon indigenous tradition in Tibet.
Okay. What's the best way for people to find out more about Buddhism, to start to dip their toe in? And where can people find out more?
Oh, there's so much content out there. There are numerous courses online offered through Coursera. There's a Buddhist Studies website that offer online courses. Many YouTube clips on almost every topic under the sun related to Buddhism. They're great books introducing meditation practice, Buddhist philosophy. It's just a great time to be alive. And unlike my younger self in the 90s, who couldn't find much content, now the internet is just full with possibilities. Just go to Amazon, Introduction to Buddhism, Buddhist meditation, YouTube. It's very accessible these days.
Okay. And where can people find out more about you as well?
Well, I didn't mention that, but part of how Buddhism helped me was that I realized later in life that I was dealing throughout my whole life with ADHD. And as part of my way to work with this condition, I benefited a lot from meditation practices and how to allocate my attention. And one of the insight is that social media is not working well for me. So I'm not very active on social media. I have a Twitter account, but mostly people can get update from my website on the Department of Religion at George Washington University. An email there, always happy to talk to people. Yeah, and then I sometimes do tweet.
Well, very good. Eyal, thank you for coming on the podcast. And I don't know, I know it's an intro. I need to learn more about Buddhism because I don't know much. But like you said, thankfully, there's tons of resources. So Thank you for your insights and for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.